everyone, and welcome to Stage Talks, a podcast series celebrating everything theatre and dance at the Capstone. My name is Ashla Montero, and I am so glad to have joining me today Seth Panitch, the head of acting programs at the department, for our last podcast episode of this semester. Seth is an actor, director, playwright, and filmmaker with works that have received national and international acclaim. He is here to talk to us about his works adapting classics for stage and his process as a playwright. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for being here today, Seth. I know with the semester almost coming to an end, there's so much going on, and so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us virtually.
Of course, I'm just glad you said the semester is going to end. That's great.
14 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you wear so many hats in our department, and one of those many hats is that of a director. And you direct a lot of Shakespeare shows, specifically in the department, but you also write and produce your own shows at the department and all over the country. So I thought we could start by talking about your process of adapting a play, especially what we would call maybe a classic play, and then about your process of creating a new one.
Okay, great.
So my first question to you is, as a director, when you have a script, especially something like a Shakespearean play, what is the first thing you do?
Well, the first thing I do is cry because Shakespeare's difficult. So that's my first step. I think it depends on the circumstances under which I'm directing the Shakespeare. So when it's here, I've usually chosen it in concert with design to make sure it's a play that they're passionate about as well. I've also chosen a play that I think is different than the Shakespeares that we've done within the last, because we do Shakespeare every other year. You're trying to find that variety with the students as well, trying to find that casting variety. I want to make sure I can choose a play that can train our students. So that's my focus, not my experience with the play. When I've worked at Shakespeare Festival, sometimes I've been brought on to do a play that they're asking me to do, so I have nothing to do with the choice of it. And then other times, when I have a relationship with that festival, as I do with Colorado, they'll say, what are the plays that you'd like to do? And we see if that's something that fits in their festival. So they're all, I approach all of them differently. I can talk about the one at school first, and then if there's something you want me to address about the professional experience, I'm happy to do that as well. At school, there's already a level of familiarity I'll have with the play because, obviously we need to present the play to the faculty for them to consider it. So I'm not going to it blind and cold. When I'm doing any classic play, so it can be the same thing that I do with Moliere or Ibsen or anything where we got a dead person writing, right? There's dead man walking, there's, dead person writing. Any of those times, I've already responded to something in the script that is personal to me. Obviously, what I should say before we talk is that everything I'm saying, I don't think is right. I think it's right for me. And I think anybody who goes into directing has to figure out what's right for them. But for me, because I came to directing as an actor, I was first an actor, and then I did find work as a director because some of the actors in the company didn't want to direct, and I did. So it was just another challenge for me, and my training as a director was as an actor. I have to emotionally connect with the material or find a ghost in the machine. It could be music and the sound that I'm after. It could be the image that I'm looking for in terms of how the actors interact with the audience and the set. It could be a time that I think is evocative of what's going on in the play, or it could be movement. So for Othello that I did here, for some reason that's coming to mind now for me, maybe because I just saw a scene in Shakespeare class from it. But for Othello, for me, I was looking at the central issue, which is how do we make what's happening to Othello experiential to the audience so they understand why Othello does not jump to a sensible conclusion that he's being lied to by Iago. And what I came up with in that was dance. I thought that if I could find through movement and expressive movement, the symbols of what Othello and Iago were saying behind scrims, and the audience could see physically what Othello was talking about, the horror of that I thought would be greater than if the language was just delivered. And so I had that idea for a single scene. And then what I'll do is sit down and see, does that work or is that an overlay? And so you got to go through the whole script and figure out whether or not that works or it doesn't. At the same time, what I'm doing as a director is finding our company's script in what is a 3.5 to 4 hour play, which there are many reasons why you'd want to cut a Shakespeare script. The first is because he cut it. And what we have are a compilation of all the different versions of that play that was done for 10, 15 years as Shakespeare continued to tinker with it. I also think a modern audience does not sit for 3 to 4 hours in the same way. A Shakespearean audience, they'd be eating at the same time, they'd be yelling at each other, sometimes they'd focus in, sometimes they'd focus out. We have a very different experience in the theater. It's a much more distilled experience. And so I think because it's that focus level, it needs to be shorter. But it's a personal feeling that I have, which is I don't want to spend all night in theater, and I'm a theater person. And so I want the play to move. In Shakespeare, everybody knows what's going to happen. So if you give them time to think and process, they're going to think the end scene. So that's the other reason I cut, is to keep the audience slightly behind us as we perform it, as we go through. So those two things are happening at the same time, which is that central, it could be music, a music time period, a composer, a style of music, or an image that I work through the piece as I cut it. And that's how I find my emotional way in. And if I can't do it, then the piece is wrong. And so I'll move to a different piece. But that's usually my first step. And once I get that idea, I go to designers and see if there's any interest, in that, and bringing interesting ideas and concepts to what I'd like to do. The professional one is very different. Sometimes it's just dumped in my lap, which is much more terrifying because I do not have an emotional connection. And then I do have to work harder to find something in that script that speaks to me, that I feel is something that I'm going through or have gone through. And so in that respect, I suppose I do respond to material as an actor first when I'm going to direct. Does that answer enough of the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So much good stuff. How do you go about finding that emotional connection when there's something that's given to you? Because I know that at the department, we have this whole process of going through the season selection committee where we talk about what's going to be best for the students in completing their theatrical training before they graduate and sort of addressing those needs. But there's still some wiggle room in figuring out what kind of a show you want to produce. But how do you do it when there's something given to you? Because also the target audience is different in professional theater as it is, as opposed to our department.
I feel, and I don't mean to sound cold about this, but I feel it's my job to find something personal in it. An actor is handed material that he or she did not write, right? All the time. And I believe lazy actors change the text. Now, there are certain words that just don't sound good in an actor's mouth, and I understand that, right? We all speak in our own signatures, and I get that. And when I'm an actor, there's always a few lines that I'll ask for adaptation. But if the director says no, it's my job to make it work. But I think as a director, it's your job to find something in that material. There are very few pieces of material that I couldn't find something of myself in. Now, Astrid, it may be a very small part of myself. So my first show here was given to me. It was 5th of July. And it was a play that I had seen, but I really had no emotional connection with. And to be honest with you, I did not like the script. But it doesn't matter. We don't have to like everything we do. It is a job. And it was a challenge for me to find something in the script. For me, it was music. I knew I was going to put live music in it because these people referenced music. We were talking about the 60s, people in the 70s and 80s talking about the 60s. And music was such an important part of that. And the other thing I found in that script was he was a teacher, right? So those were my two things, live music and a teacher. And from that, I was able to build a root system into the play. The other thing that when you, as young directors, if they're listening, if anyone's listening other than my mother, if young directors can find one thing, you don't have to find a lot, you don't have to find the play. If you can find one thing that can anchor you into the role, from that, it's like a lens through which you view the entire script. You do view it through those sunglasses, and it's going to filter some things out, and it's going to pull other things in brilliant colors. And I think that's why we're able to do scripts over and over. The way you direct 5th of July will be very different than the way I do it, and I think that's important. I think a director's interpretation, and more important, a director's emotional connection with the material is as important as any other part of the process. Not more important, but as important. And so because of that, there will be times, every time I do a Shakespeare, by the nature of cutting, but even if I didn't cut, that I will leave out that are not interesting to me. But I'll tell you, Shakespeare left a lot of stuff out too that was not interesting to him. All of a sudden, you don't see a character like Laertes for about 8 hours, and he pops back up onto the stage, and the audience can catch up. So I think that directors should have that license to focus on what interests them and let that be the cornerstone of the world that they're trying to create. I don't believe it's our job to connect with every single thing in the piece. Just as the playwright, when they're writing about an issue, are not trying to do every aspect of that issue. They're trying to do the parts of that issue that they find fascinating or challenging or troubling to them. And so I think we can follow that lead.
Next question was, during the production, what do you think are the different aspects that you focus on to bring that production to life? You spoke about music, you spoke about movement with Othello. So are there any other things that, or just from the script, what do you tend to focus on?
Well, if it's a classic piece, I focus on language and the music of that language, because heightened language, the action of the play, is a combination of the intention of the actor, although I think that that's secondary in Shakespeare. The intention is the rhetoric, the poetic rhetoric. So it exists on an argumentative level, Shakespeare does, and Molière does comic argumentative level, but it also exists on a musical level in terms of the sounds of the words being used. And of course, Shakespeare came up with a bunch of words because he felt like he didn't like the sound of the word that was available to him at the time. So sound, rhetoric, clarity, early on in the process, clarity is key. And it's not just verbal clarity, but action clarity, what's going on in the scene. And I try to bring that into rehearsal in a very specific way. The way that I work is, I'm not taking this from Shaw, but I did hear Shaw talk about this once, and I thought, well, that's how I work. Shaw believed that a director should come in, and this is even worse than me. He believed that every single moment of the play should be put on the actors on the first day, which is every turn of the head, every inflection, everything. And then the next day, you should do nothing. And the actors should develop from that point. What I do is I bring in a very specific outline, but it's very specific in terms of the action of the play, of what's going on in the scenes. And then each day I take a step back. It is a large step, hopefully, if the actors are doing their work. If they don't, I have to stay in the frame. But I prefer to step out each time and let the actor fill that in. As the actor fills that in, they now are starting to learn about the play and understand the character better than I do. So if you talk about a continuum, I believe a director goes into the first day knowing 100% about the play, and the actor knows next to nothing, because they might be coming from another gig. We might be in rep in a professional theater, which means you just opened another show. You have not gotten a focus on this show. It's my job to spend the 4 months to come in and be the pro on it. As I begin to stage and we begin to work through scenes and talk them out, then the actors start to get a handle on the world. Actors' anxiety starts to leave, right? They're new actors in the company. Young actors don't have to prove anything. They can tell their mom, I'm in a play, get off my back, right? So all those things happen. Our actors get more comfortable. They start taking the lead. About halfway through the rehearsal process, I give the baton to them and start backing out, and then the actors know more. And their choices start to really land and make sense within the world that we've created. So there are some actors that can be shocked with how much prep I bring in the beginning. But I try to make it clear that I'm not married to anything but my wife. And as we continue through the process, if you give me a better idea, we go with it. And I do stick with that. I don't need my signature to be the thing that's there opening night. But I feel, Astorilla, it takes the pressure off the actors. If I go in the first day and say, let's say we have COVID and we can't rehearse for 5 weeks and then we have to open, we have a show. So I try at the end of that first week to have a sketch of a show that could open and, most importantly, entertain an audience. Then we have 4 weeks to make it far better.
So speaking of the show that you create, the show that you take in, how do you adapt classics to contemporary times? Because many of the plays, many of the classics were written in and for a very specific period of time. So there's a certain context that surrounds a lot of these plays. So how do you remove that play from that context and make it relevant to today and balance that out with the actors' interpretations as well as your own interpretation?
To be honest with you, I don't always do that because I don't believe that the context of 1595 is completely immaterial to us today. When you're dealing with playwrights that deal with universal things, such as jealousy and Othello, I believe that Othello is about someone that doesn't believe he's worthy of Desdemona, and that's how Iago attacks him. Because Iago's attacks on the surface are stupid. It's that Othello already believed them before the play starts. I don't think that that's out of context. Now, there are certain lines that are anti-Semitic or racist. I think we fall into the trap of seeing an anti-Semitic line and thinking it's an anti-Semitic play. So I do agree with you in that context. And same thing with racial issues and those sorts of issues. So I do believe in cutting those sequences out when it was a comfortable vernacular to Shakespeare or Moliere, which is uncomfortable and racist to us. I'll cut that stuff right out. And again, if I don't put Shakespeare up on a pedestal when I'm cutting, it makes it easier for me to excise that. But I need to make sure that I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when I'm looking at something that was written 400 years ago, because people loved each other, lusted each other, and hated each other the same exact way in 1597 as they do today. And I think that there's a danger of us not understanding that we are a product of millions of years of development, of emotional development, of spiritual development, and thinking that everything began yesterday. And so maybe that's why I love classical theater, Astorilla, because it reminds us that Romeo and Juliet is not an old play. It's a play about parents giving up their responsibility and not raising their kids. So the poor nurse and the friar, who have no business doing this, are raising the kids and telling them stupid advice. And I think those are universal themes. So I think the other key to it, Astorilla, is making sure when you are looking at the piece that you're emotionally connected to it, like we talked at the beginning. I think if you're emotionally connected to the piece, it's because you're looking at it from 2021. So already I think you're on the right track. Excise, and don't be afraid to excise anything. Shakespeare made mistakes, and Shakespeare made mistakes on entire plays. He was an actor who understood rehearsal and rewriting, and if he would have continued to work, he would have continued to revise those plays. They were revised throughout his life. So we as artists have to keep revising it when it's in our hands. It's tougher, of course, with a modern playwright. You can't do that without having the playwright in the room. That's why you've got to get the playwright in the room. As a playwright, I do not mind if someone, I don't have to be in the room. I'm a very different animal when it comes to that. If someone takes my play, I don't care what they do with it. I don't care. Someone wants to do my play, go ahead. But most playwrights don't feel that way, and that has to be respected. So you got to get the playwright in the room.
And then along the same lines, how do you balance the originality of the play? I know you alluded to it a little bit at the start, but how do you sort of balance this originality with, as you mentioned, the audience is usually informed. They know the story, they know the plot. So how do you maintain that originality when you cut stuff out and balance it with watching it through a modern eye?
Yeah, you have two issues when you're in, now I'm talking about professional Shakespeare. So you got people, half the audience shows up. I remember the first time I acted at Colorado Shakespeare, I had a lot of monologues downstage center, which is an actor you're like so happy about. So I was so thrilled. But it's a 1,000-seat house, and 500 of those people have brought their Shakespeare scripts with them, and they're open on their lap. And when something's cut by the director, you'll see them just tisk and shake their heads. It's a horrifying experience. So some of the people in professional theater, Astorilla, are there because they want it delivered to them. And they paid the same price as someone who wants something brand new. And I'm always cognizant of the fact that this is a service industry, that our art is to serve our audience primarily, not ourselves. They pay our salaries, right? Because of that, I don't want to excise everything in that play that might be something they need, right? I know that I'll probably excise something they do need, but and Shakespeare did the same thing. He had an audience that wanted something exciting and different and emotional, and he had another half of his audience that wanted bear baiting. So they wanted sword fights, and they wanted sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And he was able to put both of those, and sometimes it's incongruous, and you're looking at these scenes, you're like, why the hell is this comic scene in here? Well, he's trying to please everybody, and I think we have to do that too, right? And I know the designers do that in their designs, so I think we're all doing that. In terms of how to keep it original and fresh, one way is to, and I hadn't thought of this until you asked it, front load the play with your style. And I heard this great piece of advice from a writer. He's one of the producers on The Boys. And he was giving me feedback on my screenplay that I'm shooting this summer. And he said, don't save story, which I thought was really a wonderful piece of advice. And I've given it to my actors as well since, which is you've got this great idea in the third act, but if the audience is asleep by the third act, what's the use of it? So one way, and I hadn't thought of this, but I do this as a director, is I like to front load what I'm going to do. Sometimes directors do that with dumb shows to show you through movement and music, this is going to be a different world. It would be the equivalent of an overture in a musical, right? To set the world and to let you transform into that world before the play begins. In Hamlet, I did it very specifically with recorded music of jazz, original jazz, because this was going to be spoken word. And the first monologue that I did, I went heavy on the style. So I wanted the audience to understand that all Hamlet speeches were going to be to music, and they were going to be rhythmic in the way the Beat Poets were rhythmic and Jack Kerouac was rhythmic. And that was going to be our style. So I think if you front load it and you really immerse the audience, they will hopefully see this as a new world that has new rules in it and will try not to get in front of you. But the other way we said is to cut the script, make it move. Don't make choices just to surprise an audience. I think that's what happens in bad horror movies, and we don't want to do that. I think the other thing you do, Astorilla, is you make sure that the moment is emotional transitional moments that actors go through with lights, with prop, set, and the actor's intellectual and emotional transition are so honest and compelling that the audience can't move forward. If you see someone, if you're walking through the quad and you see someone just stop, lean over, put their hands on their knees, and just close their eyes, you'll stop and watch no matter where you're going, because that person's going through some kind of travail, and it's compelling. It's unfortunately why we stop at car accidents. It's probably why people watch the horror that is reality TV. There's something in major, right? You're laughing because you know it's true.
I am laughing.
There's something in major life transitions when people are under intense crisis. Now, it could be the crisis of falling in love and I can't get this guy out of my head or whatever it is. That crisis is so compelling, the audience has to stay with us. If you make sure as a director that you have one of those in every scene, or two or three, for God's sake, then the audience has to live by that heartbeat in the show, and they can't get ahead of the pulse that you're giving them. We don't always achieve that, and hopefully it's a majority of the time in a play, but nothing's perfect. That's what we try to do.
Pivoting into creating new plays. Personally, I've had the opportunity of seeing two of the plays you have originally created, Separate and Equal, my first year here, and The Semester Shooting Star. Mm-hmm. How did you go from directing shows to writing them?
Well, writing was something I actually always did. It was my first love, and somehow I got off track. I went into acting to help my writing. I fell into the trap that a lot of young artists do, which is if I'm successful in something, then I just keep doing it without thinking about, was this what I actually wanted to do? So I woke up in a production of Hamlet. I think I was 29. And I was on stage and it was under the stars. It was beautiful. Pasadena. It's just a beautiful space outdoors. And I loved the cast I was in. I had a terrific director. He was a recurring role in Seinfeld, very funny guy. And I couldn't wait to get home every night and work on a play. And I thought, if I can't get a thrill out of Hamlet, I think I got some issues as an actor. And that's really when I started transitioning to try to write more than I acted. Before that, I used writing to make myself opportunities as an actor. So I wrote plays as a showcase. So the plays themselves really read as more of a showcase than a piece of material. One of them is called Damn It, Shakespeare in Los Angeles and got some great LA Times reviews, and that got picked up by a New York producer. But she said, you got to rewrite this play because it's a two-person showcase. So luckily, and again, I'm someone who loves to understand that there's a tradition, that there's a path that I can follow. I do not have to reinvent the damn wheel all the time. She was 92 at the time, Lily Turner. She had founded the off-Broadway movement. She founded the Village Gate and the Village Cricket. And my director had worked with the greatest Shakespearean actors of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and he was in his 80s. So for me, it was an incredible education, Astorilla, of people who had done this for 50 years professionally, 60, 70, 80 years, and knew everybody. It was transformative for me. But they helped me understand the difference between a showcase and a play. So I completely reworked the play. We did a bunch of workshops, and that's when I started writing plays. And then my second play is what I was writing while I was doing Hamlet. And then after Hamlet, I really curtailed back my acting. I would act maybe once a year and work on 2 to 3 pieces of writing per year. And that's how that transitioned. And it reminded me, and it still happens to all of us, so here I am at 53 next month, right? And I have had to wake up as a director and say, where's my writing? And my wife and I have this conversation all the time when she says, where's your writing? You have another opportunity to direct, right? You're being offered professional gigs, but is that what you want to do? And I think that anybody who can do more than one thing, that hopefully that's all of us, or we're going to be bored stiff. And for me, it was writing, acting, and directing, and I could do all those things. Just because a door opens doesn't mean you step through it. That has to be part of your plan. And I think that my directing has overwhelmed my writing because writing always takes the back seat. I think that's something that all writers go through. Everything will take precedence. First of all, you're writing usually at your house, right? So you have a wife, a partner, a husband, a dog. So there are going to be issues. The dishes are piling up, right? You have, quote, writer's block, although I believe there's no such thing as writer's block. And I don't ever have it. But you're staring at a screen. You're terrified. So writing will always take a backseat. Directing can't. You've got a rehearsal at 6 o'clock, right? Acting can't. You've got an audition at 2. So writing is the thing that I love the most. It's the thing that helps me transform the most because the whole world is mine and there's a pressure in that, but there's such a joy when it clicks. And it's the thing that I do the least. And I think it depresses me enormously. If we can have a Freudian couch moment, you and I. But I didn't fall into it. I did it since when I was a kid. It's how I got into a school once. In 3rd grade, I wrote an essay. She just asked for a technical essay. And I wrote Jaws 2 before Jaws 2 came out. So writing has always been my love. And I think it's because my mother raised me on reading at a very early age. And so that's where I've wanted to focus.
What do you take inspiration from when you create a new play?
Well, now I'm going to contradict myself. A world I'd like to act in, even if I'm not going to act in it. And I think that's what helps about doing more than one thing is that they'll inform each other. Right? If you were a designer as well, or you're a producer, whatever it is. So for me, I want to be in that world. So it could be my actor brain talking, or it could just be the creative writer brain talking. If that's a world that scares me, and so I like that terror. So it's something that I see, and then I can't stop processing. And I think we all do that, but I think we don't. It's not that we don't trust. It's sometimes as actors don't think that their own personality is enough. I think writers don't trust that their first impulse on something they see or hear is enough. It's the same fear in both writers and actors. So for Separate and Equal, it was going through many years ago, the Civil Rights Museum here in Birmingham. And it was the moment, they have this incredible movie that you watch. It's just stunning, the specificity and the horror of the film. And then the screen separates. The last image is the 2 water fountains. It's even emotional to think about it now. And the screen separates and they have 2 water fountains behind there, white in color. And it hit me like a punch. It was so awesome that I couldn't move from that area. And it wasn't that I knew I wanted to write something. It was that I had, again, an emotional response to something. And I started thinking about it. And I saw behind it was a list of the codes, the Jim Crow codes. And I looked at one and one said, white and colored children cannot play together. Obviously, yes. And I understand that historically, but seeing it was a different thing. And I thought, gosh, what if they accidentally did? So I think every writer sees a what if. Just I think every actor does, every director. So what if Hamlet was a beat poet, right? And then people laugh at you and then you do it. So for me, it's what if those kids were on the court? It's a single statement. For the film that I'm working on right now that I wrote last year that I'm going to shoot this summer, it's what if you realized you were the devil and didn't know it? That single statement, and then everything comes off of that statement. I think Shooting Star was different because Billy came to me. His best friend had seen Separate and Equal, and then he asked to see the film of the play. And he said, I want you to write my life story. And I said, I can't write a life story. That's a biography. I can't do it. And what I said to him is, what if, there's the what if again, right? We used some signposts in your story to tell a universal story about artistry, about young artists going out into the world for the right reasons and then falling into all the wrong ones. And how do you come out the other side? And one line that kept occurring to me was, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the line that I wrote to counter that is, what's the road back paved with? Because there's a road back. And for Billy, just talking to that man, he's so positive, he's so energetic, and he's been through such crap in his life. It kind of humbled me. And so that's what I wanted to capture. And so what if we did it through a character that's him but not him, in a world that's his but not his, and then that one thought sort of went through everything else.
Digressing a little bit from the conversation that we're having about writing plays and stuff, a lot of what you're talking about boils down to two things from what I'm hearing. The first one is the universality of human experience, and the other one is an emotional connection. And would it be accurate to say that all three sides, your directing side, your acting side, and your writing side, all of them sort of connect to those two ideas?
Yeah, and it's all the same thing. I mean, for me, acting, I may prefer writing, but acting and directing, for me, the experience is the same, which is transformation into another world. And using that transformation to hopefully inspire an audience to go through a similar transformation and yet one that's completely independent. So that's the contradiction, isn't it? We're seeking for something that's universal. And the way that we seek for the universal from the audience is being personal and being different. But somehow that unlocks this universal connection with your audience. Because everybody goes through the same shit, they just do it in slightly different ways. So you've got to show them the same shit in a different light.
Yeah, it reminds me of Roland Barthes' Death of the Author. Every person has its own interpretation. The author's intention doesn't matter at the end of the day.
You know, as a writer, I believe in that, but my fellow writers will burn me at the stake for saying that. So I do acknowledge that that's what you and I have just said is not what everybody believes, and art is in the eye of the beholder. But what I behold is, for me personally as a writer, I don't need my intention, unless I'm also directing it, I don't need my intention to come through. My intention better come through, and if it doesn't, then I haven't done my job as a writer. I believe that a writer interprets what they see in the world and translate it into ink blots on a page. And then the director and actor and designers translate that into physical things that the audience perceives, and then the audience translates that into something else. That's the biggest game of telephone that you could ever create. How could you possibly expect that what was said at the first part of that is still going to be there at the end? And we're worrying about the wrong thing. Let's tell a compelling story. Let's enjoy the process, for God's sake. And then let the audience figure it the hell out. That's their job. Let them work a little bit. They're watching reality TV, right? Let them do some work. So many people don't read today because I think they don't want to work. A novel requires us to be director, designer, actor, producer. It demands that of us, and too many people want to shortcut it. There's this horrifying commercial right now. It's about a gaming system, and it says improving humanity through gaming. I would think that would be doing the reverse. But I think that's where we're going. I think that gives us a more difficult job, Astorilla, which is why I think we need to focus on exactly what you're talking about, which is let's worry about our intention and make sure that as best we can, it is a natural interpretation of the intention that existed that we picked off the page or off the designer or off this or off that. And I think that's the best sort of collaboration that we can possibly do.
Yeah, it takes a village to put up a production.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, how do you sort of take a new play that you've created to stage? So how many iterations does it go through? And I'm sure it depends on the play that is being written, but what does that development process look like of something that is in your head and your idea put down to paper and then being disseminated and having the thoughts, interpretations of so many different people?
I think that's what's tough about it. So working on my screenplay, I've done 7 full drafts of the screenplay, and the first draft was, I think, 166 pages, which is interesting because if it's about the devil, I loved seeing 6s in the script, which I had a number of times. I thought I'd be done on the 6th draft because I thought that would be perfect because there was my third 6, but it took a 7th draft and it'll probably take more. What happens is you get that first draft out, it's humongous. But what I always remember as a writer, and once you've done it a few times, you can have this confidence, Astrella, which is the script's in there somewhere. It's in there, but you got to chip away at everything that's not the script, which is what apparently Michelangelo said about the David. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it's a great story. So you chip away at all that stuff. And as you do that, you refine what's there or change or throw out or add to it because it's not just chipping down. There's adding and changing and shifting. I don't believe I've had the experience of the first draft being so bad that I threw the whole thing out and started again. But there have been final drafts that have been over 50% different than the first draft, depending on the piece. There's a huge, big first draft. I immediately go back and rewrite it because I know there's a whole bunch of dog dung in there. And I go through and I refine it as much as I can, being as close to it as I've been, because I've gone through a research period, which is about a month, then an outline period, which is about 2 weeks of just outlining scenes and knowing what, again, like a director, I do the same thing as a writer. What's the structure of the story, although I'm not married to it as I go through, and then getting that first draft up. So that whole process probably takes 4 months to get the first draft up and strong and already one rewrite under it. Then I try to put it away for 2 weeks and I send it to my readers, people I trust, to read it because I'm too close to it. And then those notes come back and it's agonizing because I thought it was perfect, which of course I knew it wasn't, but you have hopes. And you look at those notes and you're like, oh, I got so much work to do. And then you go back and you trudge through those other drafts until it starts to clarify and the notes that come back are more and more specific and less general. You know you've got a story. Then it starts going out to a director, and that, I think this is the toughest part if you're not directing your own material. It's probably why I directed a lot, is having to step back from managing the story if a director is going to direct it. And I'm in that process now with the gentleman that co-directed my last film with me. But now I'm going to act in this one and he's going to direct. So then I have to let him direct. And that's a difficult process. But once you give up that ownership, your mind can start working on the next project. I think that's the key for writers. If you want to make the transition to letting someone else interpret your material, start working on the next piece. Don't agonize. Don't watch someone having intimacy with your partner. Move on, because that's sort of what it feels like.
So you talked about having a humongous first draft and then chipping down at it, and I wanted to revisit that a little bit. Personally, I also have written stuff in the past I have been sort of married to, and man, this is great, I really like this. And then someone comes and tells me, no, it's not, you need to get rid of that. So how do you sort of detach yourself, this piece that you really like, but it's not going to translate well, and it might be great in your head, but it isn't in reality?
I would tell them 2 things. First of all, you have to remember that not all feedback is what you want. So you don't have to agree with all feedback unless that's the director and it's film. Different in theater. In the theater, the playwright has the last say. In film, the director has the last say, unless you're also the producer. And that's why I'm producing my film. So it's not always correct. What I think the best advice is don't look at the solution that they're offering you. Look back at the scene and say, I'm not reaching that audience. Why? There's something that I'm doing that's not allowing the audience to connect with what I'm doing. Don't use their solution. Unless it's genius and you want to steal it, put your name on it, then yeah, of course, always steal their solution if it's good.
Wonderful. On that note, thank you so much for being here with us, Seth. If there's anything you would like to add, you can do that right now.
Sure. If people are interested in writing, I will be teaching the writing classes next year. I'm going to be teaching playwriting, and then the year after that, I'll be teaching screenwriting. So if what I said didn't put you into a coma and you'd like to know more about it, take the class.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Seth. And thank you for tuning into this episode of Stage Talks. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at UA Theatre and Dance for updates on upcoming episodes, which can be found on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/theatreanddance.